Hey guys, what's going on? This is Tom from The Strength Agenda. I've been getting a lot of questions about programming lately, so I figure we take a little bit of time, go to the whiteboard, explain how we do our programming here. Just a couple of, disclaimers or anything about this. This is how I have found it best to program for my athletes. This is not the end-all be-all. I'm not saying you have to do this, but for those of you who like to just learn and want to know different ways of doing things, or just might want to see how other people get the job done, this may be something that helps you out. So first things first, when I program 8 weeks at a time. I do at the beginning of each big, well, let's backtrack a little bit. When I look at the year, the calendar year, I kind of split it up into two halves. The first half is focusing towards the national championships, which are in May, and then the second half focuses on the American Open, which is at the beginning of December. So at the beginning of each of those halves, I will do a 12-week phase, which I can discuss later, but for the remainder of the year, I handle everything in 8-week waves, or 8-week training cycles. That's just a lot easier for me to manage. Months have 4 weeks in them, usually, unless you get those random ones with 5 weeks. But for the most part, 4 weeks at a time is a lot easier for me to manage, and it's easier for me to plan that way because I can see what's working for my athletes, what needs to be adjusted in the second half of a training cycle, and we kind of go from there. So the basics of my 8-week layout that I use for training people. It's 2 4-week blocks. Like I said, it's just easier, with the months of the year. They usually have about 4 weeks, so I just go off of that. But each block is a little bit different. Each block has its own set of movements. I like to throw in a lot of variation, a lot of variety, because I'm a firm believer if you do the same thing over and over and over and over again, athletes are going to lose interest, they're going to get bored, and they're going to start to stagnate in their training. So each 4-week block has its own set of movements. But both blocks put together, they focus on the same emphasis. Or each of my 8-week phases has a theme, so to speak, and both 4-week blocks work on that theme, but they just might use a couple different movements that help accomplish the goal that we set to accomplish at the end of that 8-week training phase. Just give you a little bit of basics on programming in particular. Macro cycles, that's essentially how I look at the year. For me, it's usually that one of the halves of the year is a macro cycle. Mesocycle is just one of these 8-week phases, and then microcycles are each individual week. Now, if we go over here, how I break down the weeks. As the weeks go on, so like I said, we have 8 weeks in here, 2 4-week waves. As the weeks go on, the intensity will increase as the week goes on, and the reps will go down. That's just, plain and simple progression. Works the best for athletes, unless we are in a base building phase where the volume is going to be relatively high throughout the entire, probably the first 4-week training block. But again, I will discuss that on a later date. We're just talking the 8 weeks. Each week builds on the previous week's work. I have a little bit of a diagram here we will go over, and I'll explain that further. In the training cycles, weeks 3 and 7 are usually the heaviest weeks. Week 3 and 7 are heavy. 3 is usually not as heavy as 7. 7 is the heaviest week in the training cycle. If I'm going to plan a local meet, or if my athletes want to go do a local meet, I try to get them to do it either in week 3 or week 7. Here at the Strength Agenda, we use local meets as just glorified heavy days. A little bit of more meet practice, just go. We have your attempts planned out. We're not necessarily going to max out, just maybe make some lifts. So weeks 3 and week 7 will be the heaviest lifting of the training phases. So I try to plan local meets around that time. If we are planning for a much bigger meet, we will do a full-on taper for that, and I'll explain that in a next few bullet points. Week 4 is what I call a back-off week, and in week 4, what drops is the intensity and sometimes the volume in the lifts, or what we are focusing on. But the strength work and accessory movement still stays high. So all we're really backing off of is the snatch and clean and jerk variations. Squats, pulls, accessory work still remains relatively high in comparison to previous weeks. And then week 8 is a complete deload. I'll explain that more once we get down to the little layout of the training cycle. But week 8, we back off of everything. The squats are backed off. We might not squat as many days as we did in the previous training cycle or the previous weeks. We might not be doing as much accessory work, if any at all. And then the percentage and the reps on the snatch, clean, and jerk variations themselves are very, very low. Within each week, we alternate between heavy days and position technique days. Unless you have certain aid at your disposal, it is going to be very hard for you to go heavy day after day after day after day. There are those few that can pull it off, but the large majority of us are not able to. So how we combat that is we alternate heavy days with position, I call them positional days, position work, technique work, speed work, usually a little more repetition, but at lower percentages than the heavy days. And usually one day out of the week is our heaviest day of the training or of the training week. Usually that's towards the end of the week on day 5. But as I was talking about earlier with planning for a bigger meet, if we have a bigger meet, like a state meet, regional meet, the AO series, what we usually will do, or what we do is we will plan a 2-week taper, and we will start that week 7. Usually about 2 weeks out from a competition, you want to be lifting your heaviest. So week 7 is our heaviest week of the training cycle. So we will start our taper usually around week 7. And whatever I had planned for week 7 and 8, we kind of throw out, and I have a taper that I plug in there. Now, if it is a big meet like Nationals, the American Open, or any international competition, I have my own lead up into those meets that I follow. But if it's a little bit of what I call like an intermediate level meet, we will throw in a 2-week taper starting in week 7. Now, how I set up a week. This is, again, just a rough idea. Can't really give you everything that we do here because then there'd be no reason for people to come in here and work with us. So each training block is split up, as I said, into 4 weeks. And this is just a rough idea. These are just the rough percentages that I use per training block. So week 1, percentages are usually around 80%. We might do triples, might do doubles. Just kind of depends on the athlete. And when I use these percentages, I don't go off of whatever the variation is. Nobody has all that written out. Well, not nobody. Most people don't have all their PRs for every variation of the lift written out. They know, though, if you ask them with their power snatch, their power clean, their jerk, their clean and jerk, their clean and their snatch, they'll be able to tell you. So those are the percentages I go off of when I'm planning out work for that week. So week 1 will be roughly around 80%. Week 2, we'll up it a little bit to about 85%. The reps will start to come down. Week 3, like I said, we'll either stick around 90% or we may go and test and go to heavy singles in whatever variation of the lift that we are doing that week. And then week 4, as I said, I go down to roughly about 80%. Now I have a little bit of a star here, and the reason I made that little notation is what I do on the back off weeks is I go 80% of the lifts hit in the previous week. Whatever the heaviest you hit, you might have hit your heaviest in week 2, week 3, I don't know, but whatever the heaviest you hit in the previous 3 weeks, that's what I base your percentages for week 4 off of. So I hope that makes sense. Then when we move on to the second half of the training phase, kind of starting over a little bit, but the movements are similar to the previous 4 weeks. So again, week 5 will be around 80%, week 6 will be around 85%, and like I said, week 7 is going to be our heaviest week of the training phase, so we go to heavy singles most likely in almost every movement that week. And if not, it'll be over 90+%. So week 7 is heavy, we kind of get after it a little bit, and that's kind of our test for the entire training cycle, to kind of see how things worked. And that's usually the most important week for me, because it allows me as a coach to see what worked for some athletes, where did they start to break down, what didn't, necessarily work for the entire group. I make little notes, and then I make adjustments for the next few training cycles, or when we come back to this themed training cycle again. And then, like I said, week 8 is complete deload. Now I put the little about thing in here. Percentages are very low. The workouts themselves for the athletes, my athletes love deload week. My wife loves deload week because I'm not at the gym as much. Deload weeks are short, sweet, to the point. Workout shouldn't take more than about an hour or so. Get in here, get warmed up, get to your lifts, but the focus is technique and doing it right. I don't want people coming in here and just kind of going through the motions and leaving. Those are the times where I emphasize making sure you're doing the movement right. Working a little more technical aspects of the lift. If there was something I noticed they were kind of struggling with, I might even during a deload week introduce new movements, drills, stuff along those lines, and keep the weights lighter on those to reinforce some bad technical habits that I saw during the week, or to help improve something leading up to the next training cycle. I also use week 8, our deload week, as a time to kind of introduce some movements that are going to be in the next training phase. If it's something that I know is going to be a little bit more complex or something that people may not have had experience with, here's where I'll kind of introduce it at very low percentages so they can kind of get acclimated to it, so that when week 1 starts up, they hit the ground running. Okay, so this is how we program 8 weeks at a time here at the Strength Agenda. If you guys have any other questions, comments, concerns, please comment below. Feel free to message us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, anything along those lines. We're here to help you guys. We want to make sure that we are giving information that makes sense and that it helps you become a better athlete. All right, until next time, take care, guys.